Dreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavate Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavatir Naishtiki Om Agyantimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakya Chakshurunmalitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Mukham karoti vācānam angam langete girim yat kripatamaham vande Shri Guru Dina Taranam Paramanandam Madhavam. Hare Krishna, thank you again for joining. We'll resume our discussion from the 4th canto, chapter 9, verse 57. This essentially comes in the section where Dhruva Maharaj has returned to the city of Maharaj Uttanpad, and all the residents of the city are happy to see him. And Maitreya Rishi is describing the wonderful decorations in the city in order to receive the great devotee of the Lord. Verse 57. Rishta Chatvar Ratyata Marjam Chandan Charchita Lajakshata Pushpa Phales Tanduler Balibhiryutim. All the quadrangles, lanes, and streets in the city, and the raised sitting places at the crossings were thoroughly cleansed and sprinkled with sandalwood water. And auspicious grains such as rice and barley and flowers, fruits, and many other auspicious presentations were scattered all over the city. 58-59. Dhruvaya pathidristhaya tatra purstiyaha siddhartakshat dadyambu durva pushpa falanicha upajaru prayunjana vatsalyada sati Shanvam Statval Guvitani Pravishad Bhavanam Pituhu. Thus, as Dhruva Maharaj passed on the road from every palace in the neighborhood, all the gentle household ladies assembled to see him, and out of material affection, they offered their blessings, showering him with white mustard seed, barley, curd, water, newly grown grass, fruits, and flowers. In this way, Dhruva Maharaj, while hearing the pleasing songs sung by the ladies, entered the palace of his father. So we see this reception very Vedic, very similar to when Krishna was leaving Hastinapur, entering Dwarka. So as is customary, that the women of the house would not come out on the road, but rather they would ascend to the roof. And from there, they will observe, in this case, the passing of Dhruva Maharaj, and they would sprinkle him with auspicious stuffs like sesame seed and barley and curd and water. And they would sing auspiciously, also make auspicious sounds or sing. So not only was the city very opulent, the earlier verse describes the opulence of the city in receiving Dhruva, but even the citizens were very, very happy to see Dhruva come back. Now, as a 5-year-old boy, it is unlikely that he had a lot of personal interaction with the citizens. But their attraction to him is because of his being connected with Krishna. Verse 60. Mahamani Vratamanye Mahamani Vratamye Satasmin Bhavanottame Lalito Netram Pitra Nivyasad Dividevava. Dhruv Maharaj thereafter lived in his father's palace, which had walls bedecked with highly valuable jewels. His affectionate father took particular care of it, and he dwelled in that house, just as the demigods live in their palaces in the higher planetary system. So the previous verses were talking about the reception of Dhruva when he entered the city. Now this verse, it kind of jumps ahead. It's talking about Dhruva Maharaj growing up in the palace of his father. So he was only 5 years old, and he had several years to grow up. So he was growing up in this opulent settings. It's also interesting to note that earlier on, when Maitreya was describing Maharaj Uttanpad sitting on the throne and Dhruv Maharaj trying to get on his lap, he did not describe the opulence of the palace. The palace of the king was always opulent. But at that time, he did not describe the opulence of the palace. Now we will see that in 5 verses, he goes into details describing the opulence of the palace. So why now? Because now it's connected to Dhruva. So in Bhagavatam, we will see once in a while, we will see a description of things that don't seem to be directly linked to devotion or Krishna. Like there may be a description of the forest with the different kinds of trees and different kinds of birds and animals. And then verses after verses talking about the different species of birds, different kinds of creepers. Similarly, if you remember when Devahuti's palace was being described, several verses describing that how her bed sheets were like white as foam, how her bedposts were inlaid with gold and ivory. Similarly, the airship of Kardamuni is described in details. But Bhagavatam is not interested so much in the material opulence of these things. The point that is being made here is that the devotees of the Lord, they live in opulence. So these opulence become noteworthy only because they're connected to the devotee. Whether Kardam or Devahuti or Krishna or Dhruv Maharaj, that's why they become opulent. So through this, the Bhagavatam, it tries to invoke this picture in our mind that if the devotees of the Lord so desire, they can live in complete opulence. Kardamuni lived in extreme austerity and extreme opulence that even the demigods could not imagine. Dhruva Maharaj in the forest, he was breathing once in 12 days, right? And living in with nothing but a kopil, in extreme renunciation. Same person is now living in extreme opulence. Both of them become glorious because they're connected to the Lord through the devotee. That is why they are Krishna Katha. Verse 61. Paya fena nibhashaya dantarukma parechadaha asnani maharani yatarokma upakshakaha. The bedding in the palace was as white as the foam of milk and was very soft. The bedsteads were made of ivory with embellishments of gold, and the chairs, benches, and other sitting places and furniture was made of gold. Very similar description to the palace of Devahutri. Verse 62. Yatra svate kakudyeshu mahamara katheshu cha mani pradeepa abhanti lalana ratna samyutaha. The palace of the king was surrounded by walls made of marble, with many engravings made of valuable jewels like sapphires, which depicted beautiful women with shining jewel lamps in their hands. Srila Prabhupada has a long purport, which is more of a preaching purport. So he notes that Dhruva had lived in the Satyug, when people live for 100,000 years. And this is first Manvantara, beginning of the creation. So, in other words, he lived millions and millions of years ago. Yet, from the Bhagavatam, we understand that the opulence of that time, it far exceeded anything that we have seen in contemporary times. We see reflections of it. Right? Sometimes we see palaces, medieval palaces that were opulent. India, we see palaces that were older palaces. You see the glimpses of opulence, but nothing compared to what is being described of these palaces. Prabhupada says that there were walls like those in the palace of Maharaj Uttanpad, even very recently during the Mughal. Anyone who has seen the Red Fort in Delhi must have marked that the walls are made of marble and were once decorated with jewels. During the British period, all these jewels were taken away and dispatched to the British Museum. The conception of worldly opulence was formerly based mainly on natural resources, such as jewels, marble, silk, ivory, gold, and silver. The advancement of economic development was not based on big motor cars. Advancement of human civilization depends on not on industrial enterprises, but on possession of natural wealth and natural food, which is all supplied by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, so that we may save time for self-realization and success in the human form of body. Another aspect of this verse is that Dhruva Maharaj's father Uttanpad would very soon give up attachment for his palaces and would go to the forest for self-realization. From the description of Srimad Bhagavatam, therefore, we can make a very thorough comparative study of modern civilization and the civilization of mankind in other millenniums, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, and Dwapar Yuga. So, interesting observation Srila Prabhupada makes that in the earlier ages, all the wealth was natural wealth. In the current ages, it is artificial wealth. Prabhupada would say currency is not even worth the paper that it is printed on. Real wealth used to be land and cows and gold. Now, even the currency is not linked to the gold. And the other point that he's making is that later on we'll see that how Maharaj Uttanpad also renounces. So it's giving a sense of what he is renouncing, the kind of opulence that he was living on. And when the time is right, then he simply leaves it all and goes into the jungle as a renunciate. Verse 63. Udyanani charamyani vichitteramardhrumai kujadvihanga gayan madhuvrtaha. The king's residence was surrounded by gardens, wherein there were varieties of trees brought from the heavenly planets. In those trees, there were pairs of sweetly singing birds and almost mad bumblebees, which made a very relishable buzzing sounds. So, Amardhrume means that these trees were bought from the heavenly planets. The Prabhupada said the heavenly planets are Amarlok. So Mar of course means to die. Amar means to not die. So sometimes people mistake the word Amar to consider that the people in the heavenly kingdom, they are immortal. But Amar actually means that they don't face premature death, unexpected death. So they live their life, which is long compared to ours. But when the time comes to die, they die. So Amar just means that they don't have premature or unexpected death. Next verse, 64. Vapyo vedurya sopana padmotpa kumudvatihi hamsakarandavakulera justaschakrvasarashe. There were emerald staircases which led to lakes full of variously colored lotus flowers and lilies, and swans and karandavas and chakravakas and cranes and similar other valuable birds were visible in those lakes. So you see that the description of the opulence has now moved from inside the palace to the surrounding of the palace. So the palace walls were described, the furniture was described. Now the surrounding of the palace is described, and the focus here again is naturally existing things. So they're not saying that there were 3 tennis courts and 2 swimming pools and an Olympic-sized basketball, but they're describing the flowers and the lilies and the variety of animals that were living in the area. And generally, this is the reason why the forests are considered to be in the mode of goodness. It's said that going to the forest is in the mode of goodness, partially because of it cuts you off from the social engagement that's more in the mode of passion, sometimes ignorance, but also because of the environment. That there are trees left to itself. Nature is harmonious. When it is interfered with, then it can take a different turn. But left to itself, nature is harmonious. Different kinds of trees and plants and animals come in, and they're all combined together to create a very strong mode of goodness. So Prabhupada says that the beautifully positioned garden houses, there were many luxuriant birds such as swans and chakravakas and karandavas and cranes. These birds generally do not live in filthy places like crows do. The atmosphere of the city was very healthy and beautiful. It can simply be imagined from its description. Okay, so in that verse, the description of the city ends. Verse 65. Utan padarajarishi prabhavam tannayasyatam shrutva drishtva duvatmamam prapte vishmayam param. The saintly king Utanpad, hearing of the glorious deeds of Dhruva Maharaj and personally seeing also how influential and great he was, felt very satisfied. For Dhruva's activities were wonderful to the supreme degree. So in the next 3 verses, we will see the growing up of Dhruva. So Prabhupada says that when Dhruva was in the forest executing austerities, his father had only heard about his activities. And now he was personally seeing it. So important point to understand here also was that when Dhruva came back to the city, he was a prince and he executed his duties as a prince. And in that also he excelled. So the devotees of the Lord are called Kavi, which means they are expert. Then whatever they do it very well, because they're doing it as a service to the Lord. There's no difference between a person going to the job and the person standing on the altar and worshiping the deities, if the consciousness of the person is that both of these are being done for the pleasure of the Lord. So Maharaj Uttanpad was now personally seeing that how Dhruva's activities were wonderful. Now, when he was back, he was not performing austerities. He was executing his responsibilities as the son of the king. And because of that, he was once again excelling in the consideration of his father and the citizens. Also, Uttanpad is called Raj Rishi here. That Raj Rishi means that a person who is a king, but who is properly situated. Same term is used for Parikshit Maharaj, Raj Rishi. That Prabhupada there says that it's called Raj Rishi because the real reason such kings rule is to help the people make spiritual advancements. So they're non-different from rishis, because the purpose of the rishi is to help people advance spiritually. And if the king is properly situated, that's exactly what they do. They're very heavy on illicit activities, and they're very supportive and conducive to spiritual activities. And Maharaj Uttanpad was not only properly situated himself, but also in terms of his duties as a king. Okay, verse 66. Vikshodavayasam tam cha prakritinam cha samatam anurakta prajam raja dhruvam chakre bhuvaha patim. So Udavayasam means that Dhruva is now reached the stage of Yovana. Yovana is 15 years of age. And what is Maharaj Uttanpad seeing? He is seeing Udavayasam. Udavayasam is that his own personal maturity, that he is sober, how he deals with the elders and the equals and those who are below him, how he is dealing with conflict. In all the respects, Dhruva is displaying a tremendous amount of maturity. Then, Prakritinam cha samatam. So, he had the approval of the ministers. So, the ministers were also approving him in terms of the activities that he was doing. And third is Anurakta Prajam, that he was the favorite of the Praja, the citizens. So seeing these three things, what does Maharaj Uttanpad do? Dhruvam Chakra Bhuvam Pati, that he enthroned Dhruv as the king. Srila Prabhupada comments that in the current day and age, the people will cling to their post until they die or they are forcibly removed. But Maharaj Uttanpad, as soon as he saw that he had a successor that was suitable to replace him, he immediately gave up his kingdom. Another point Prabhupada makes is that he comments on monarchy. He says that it is misconceived that monarchical government was autocratic. So monarchy basically means, mono means one. Monarchy means ruled by one person. And autocratic means without consultation. So Prabhupada makes this comment that people sometimes confuse monarchy with autocracy. But here you can see that it is not. That it's not that the king said that now I decree that my son becomes my successor. But he also saw that Dhruva had the approval of the ministers, he had the support of the citizens, the love of the citizens, and he was personally mature. If he was not, then Maharaj Uttanpad would not have appointed him a successor. Prabhupada says that the best form of governance is a benevolent monarchy. Benevolent means that the monarchy is properly situated, ideally in a Vedic way. Democracy, he would say, is democracy, because the majority of the people in the age of Kali are Shudras, and if you ask them to elect a representative, they will elect another Shudra. So ideal is that the qualified people are responsible for appointing a person who is more qualified than them to rule the state. And Prabhupada also comments that a qualified leader should have saintly qualities, not just material qualities. So here he makes a bold statement for devotees. He says that if the post of chief executive were occupied by a Vaishnava, all the problems of satanic government would be solved. The youthful generation of the present day is very enthusiastic and trying to overthrow the government in different parts of the world. But unless people are Krishna conscious like Dhruva Maharaj, there will be no appreciable changes in government, because people who hanker to attain political positions by hook or crook cannot think of the welfare of the people. So it's a little contrary position, and it's something that is politically not the most correct thing to say. That the majority of the people, essentially what people, as Prabhupada is saying, that the majority of the people are not likely to make the right choice. And if they do make a choice, they will pick somebody like themselves or something that they aspire to be, which is somebody who is highly materialistic, driven for power, and without any saintly qualities. So such people will not have any time for the welfare of the citizen. That is why there is this constant cycle of disappointment, that people are elected, and then the same people who are elected cheat the people who elect them. So they throw them away and elect some new people, but the underlying problem is not solved, that they continue to elect people who are unqualified. Yeah. Last verse. Atmanam cha pravyasam akalaya vishampati vanam virakta prathishtada vimrashanatmano gatim. After considering his advanced age and deliberating on the welfare of his spiritual soul, King Uttanpad detached himself from worldly affairs and entered the forest. So the king was so anxious to pursue his spiritual life that as soon as he saw that Dhruva Maharaj was qualified, he enthrones him. So it's explained that he does not even wait to get him married. The typical aspiration of a father is to get the son married, and once the son is married, then to appoint him as a successor. We see that in case of Maharaj Dashrath. And when Lord Ram was married, and after some time, he names him as a successor. It's one of the duties of the father also. But Raj Rishi, that the king was strongly invested in his own spiritual advancement, but he did not want to shirk his responsibilities. So when he saw that Dhruva was more qualified than him to take over the kingdom, he did not even wait for him to get married. He left the palace and entered into the forest. Prabhupada says that it is not possible to give up one's home and go to the forest to practice austerity. So this is in the modern days. But if people of all ages would take shelter of Krishna consciousness movement and practice the simple austerities of no intersex sex, no intoxication, no gambling, and no meat eating, and chant the Hare Krishna mantra regularly, 16 rounds, by this practical method, it would be a very easy task to get salvation from the material world. So Prabhupada is giving us practical advice here, that we don't have to follow the footsteps of Maharaj Uttanpad and head to the forest, but it's said that, what do they say, that if you cannot go to the mountains, you can get the mountains to yourself. So if you cannot go to the forest, you can get the forest in your house. So the whole purpose of going to the forest is to become spiritually invested. And if you can do the same in the house, it's as good as living in a forest. And Prabhupada gives us the basis of doing that. And following the 4 regulative principles, chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, as good as going to the forest. So with this ends the 9th chapter, and I'll quickly review it. So long chapter with 67 verses, and it begins with the Lord appearing in front of Dhruva and empowering him to speak. Then we have the 12 verses of the prayers by Dhruva Maharaj, followed by the benedictions given by the Lord, and followed by the deep regret in Dhruva at all the material benedictions that the Lord gives him. And with this regret, this feeling of regret, he heads back to his father's kingdom. Then we see the reception of Dhruva. Maharaj Uttanpad meets him, Suruchi blesses him, Suniti embraces him, his brother Uttama embraces him, everybody glorifies Suniti. Then there is a description of the city and the palace in which Dhruva Maharaj grows, talking about the opulence of both his personal palace and the city around him. And then the chapter ends with Maharaj Uttanpad seeing that Dhruva has grown up to have all the excellent qualities of an able and just ruler. He enthrones him and he retires to the forest. So it's not mentioned in details here why, so difficult to comment, but Maharaj Uttanpad obviously heads alone to the forest. His wives stay back. So sometimes the wives stay back if they have grown-up sons. In this case, both Dhruva and Uttama are there. And sometimes they accompany the husband. Both of them are acceptable. So this is the end of the 9th chapter. Dhruva Maharaj returns home. So we'll start with the 10th chapter, but before that, I'll just pause here because it's a natural break and see if there is any comments or discussion, either on what we discussed now or anything we discussed earlier. Okay, done. Then let's continue to the next chapter. So 10th chapter, 4th canto, Dhruva Maharaj's fight with the Yakshas. And again, this is a short chapter of only 30 verses, very light chapter, very, very light. Next chapter after this is heavy, but this chapter is just mostly a narrative. So mostly I think we should be able to complete this chapter in our next discussion. We'll start a little bit of it and we should complete it in our next discussion. I still have some time for any other discussions. So the chapter will talk about what happens after Dhruva is made the king or the emperor. So we see the marriage of Dhruva and his descendants, then the incident of his brother Uttam being killed, the battle between Dhruva and Yaksha, which basically is the rest of the chapter. There's a description of the different weapons and the different strategies of the battle between Dhruva and Yakshas. Okay, verse 1. Maitre vacha prajapate duhitramma shishu maraj Dhruva upyeme brahminnama tatsutao kalpavatsarao. The great sage Maitreya said, "My dear Vidur, thereafter Dhruva Maharaj married the daughter of Prajapati Shishumar, whose name was Brahmi, and two sons named Kalpa and Vatsar were born of her." So in these two verses, Maitreya will describe the marriage and the descendants of Dhruva. So Srila Prabhupada comments that even though it was the duty of Uttanpad to see his son married, but because he was confident about the capabilities of his son, and more importantly, he was anxious to focus on his spiritual advancement, he leaves. Prabhupada said these are rare instances in which we can see that the importance of spiritual realization is overall, is above all other important works. So Uttanpad is at the end of the day, he's glorified as a great soul, as a Raj Rishi. Now, because of his infatuation with his younger wife, he had committed a great offense. However, he recognized his defect and sincerely he repented and rectified. Therefore, he was cured of his defect and he was purified of his offense. So this is an important lesson, that it is important not to commit offenses, but more important is having committed offenses to rectify oneself. And the rectification is by sincerely repenting it and changing that mentality. And we see both of these things happening in Maharaj Uttanpad. In general, we also see that Bhagavatam, it talks about the fall and the rise of devotees. To give us this lesson, two lessons: to protect against the falls and what to do if one has inadvertently fallen. So both the lessons are given in this past tense. That because of being infatuated, Maharaj Uttanpad acted in a way that was not suitable. So the lesson is that if one is infatuated, then inevitably one will act in an inappropriate way. So to protect yourself against this, one should protect from lusty desires. Second is that if somehow one still commits that offense, then the quality of a great person is that they see it for what it is. They regret sincerely the offense and they rectify it. We see the similar case. This is not in Bhagavatam, this is in Mahabharata. We see the case of Pururuva. So he had excessive attachment for his wife, Urvashi. And because of that, it completely consumed him, even though he was such an exalted personality. But when he realizes his defect, then he speaks so eloquently in the Aila Gita. He speaks his realizations for our benefit. Same thing we see in the case of Yayati. That Yayati was so attached to sensual enjoyment that he became completely shameless. He went to his sons and shamelessly he was saying that you exchange my old age for your youth so that I can enjoy. Which father would like to do that? To take away the youth from their own son just so that they can enjoy their senses. But Yayati was so attached to it that he had no compunctions in going and asking his sons. And he was so bewildered that when the sons refused, he cursed them. But then the same Yayati, after 100 years of enjoyment, he speaks to Devyani. And he talks about himself as a goat, about how he was attached to sensual enjoyment, how he tries to keep on enjoying over and over again with a she-goat and then fails. And then he acts upon that realization. He gives up everything, returns the youth to his son, and then goes into the forest for austerities. Similarly, in the third canto, we see Maitreya Muni. With reluctance, he describes the episode of Brahma chasing after Vak. Right? Abominable. Going after your own daughter for sexual union. But that's not why Maitreya describes it. He describes it to show what does Brahma do when he is advised by the sages, who are essentially his sons and descendants. He does not get angry at them, but he gives up his own mentality. And with increased vigor, he goes back to his service. Similarly, we see Lord Shiva running after Mohini Murti. Parvati is standing right next to him. But then when he sees Mohini Murti, he becomes completely infatuated and openly running after her in front of all his own devotees, his sages who are worshipping Lord Shiva. Mohini Murti deliberately takes him to those places where he's worshipped as the one who is the master of the yoga. But then what happens after that? Lord Shiva says, this is actually appropriate, because who other than my Lord can put me in such a situation? So what is he seeing here? That this is a glorification of my Lord. It does not matter that I have been humiliated, but it's my Lord who's being glorified. And the lesson has been given that even great personalities like me can be influenced by lust. So all these are meant as lessons for us. They give that even great personalities are fallible to material desires, so that we who are not great personalities have to be extra vigilant. And then we recognize that the real greatness of this personality is that they recognize, regret, and rectify. That is what puts them where they are. Brahma did not fall down from his position. Lord Shiva did not fall down from his position. Yayati and who was the Pururava? Yayati and Pururava, they're still glorified as great personalities. Not because of what they did, but because how they handled what they did. That is the main lesson for us. So the lesson is that responsibility with detachment. This is selflessness. So responsibility does not mean attachment, and detachment does not mean avoiding responsibility. So the lesson here is that while we are in the middle of all this, while we are executing all our responsibilities as parents and children and citizens, so many responsibilities, but detachment. So one should not confuse detachment with giving up responsibility. Okay, next verse 2. Vilayamapi bharayam vayo putrayam mahabala putram utkal namanam yoshir ratnam ajijana. The greatly powerful Dhruva Maharaj had another wife named Ila, who was the daughter of the demigod Vayu. By her, he begot a son named Utkal and a very beautiful daughter. So Maitreya is describing the lineage from Utanpad's marriage with Suniti. Dhruva Maharaj was born. Dhruva Maharaj then married Brahmi, who was the daughter of Prajapati Shishumar, and he has two sons, Kalp and Vatsar. And then he marries Ila, who is the daughter of Vayu, and he has a son named Utkal and a beautiful daughter whose name is not given. Verse 3. Uttamastva akrodavaho mrigyayam baliyasa ata punya janenandro tanmatsya gatim gaha. Dhruva Maharaj's younger brother Uttam, who was still unmarried, once went on a hunting excursion and was killed by a powerful yaksha in the Himalaya mountains. Along with him, his mother Suruchi also followed the path of her son. She died. So 5 verses talk about the death of Uttama. So this was predicted by the Lord. Previous chapter, when he was giving benedictions to Dhruva in verse 23, the Lord had said that sometimes in the future your brother Uttam, he will go hunting in the forest and there he will be killed. And then he said your stepmother Suruchi, being maddened upon the death of her son, will go to search him out in the forest and she will be devoured by the forest fire. Verse 4. Dhruva bhratra vadham shutva kopamar sucharpitaha jaitram shandamasthaya gataha punya janalayam. When Dhruva Maharaj heard of the killing of his brother Uttam by the yakshas in the Himalaya mountains, being overwhelmed with lamentation and anger, he got on his chariot and went out for victory over the city of yakshas, Alkapuri. So Srila Prabhupada says that Dhruva Maharaj is becoming angry, overwhelmed with grief, and envious of the enemies are not compatible with his position as a great devotee. It is a misunderstanding that a devotee should not be angry, envious, or overwhelmed with lamentation. Dhruva Maharaj was the king, and when his brother was unceremoniously killed, it was his duty to take revenge against the yakshas from the Himalayas. So very important point Prabhupada makes over here, that being a devotee does not mean that one becomes devoid of emotions. That one becomes stoic, one becomes indifferent. And it is opposite to when you say that the heart of a devotee is soft, which means that it feels grief. That a devotee is empathic. They feel the They feel the anger at the other person being mistreated. So Prabhupada is pointing out three emotions that Dhruva felt. All three are considered to be tamasic. That he was angry, he was overwhelmed with grief, and he was envious. But still Prabhupada is making this point that does not mean that Dhruva fell down. Because a devotee is expected to feel all this. The only difference is that the devotee uses this in the service of Krishna. Now, Dhruva Maharaj in this case does not really do that. But again, his greatness is that he reverts to his position very, very quickly. So he goes to Alkapuri. Alkapuri is described, if you remember, in the episode of the Daksha Yagya, that once Daksha's Yag was destroyed, and then the Devas, they go along with Brahma to beg the forgiveness of Lord Shiva. And at that time, they cross into Alkapuri. And there is a description of how everything there is so elegant and opulent there. So in the verse 23, it is said that the Devas saw the wonderfully beautiful region known as Alka, in the forest known as Saugandhika, which means full of fragrance, because it was full of lotus flowers. So, question here again can be asked that were Surichi and Uttama punished for their offense to Dhruva? The Lord had actually mentioned this episode when he was giving benedictions to Dhruva. So one may say that, was this a benediction to Dhruva? That Suruchi and Uttam will be killed. However, important to notice over here is that if that was the case, then Maharaj Uttanpad should also have been punished. But we don't see any overt punishment of Uttanpad. He went through a period of grief and self-recrimination, but we don't see him being punished as if, or as in the mood one would think that maybe the Lord is punishing Suruchi and Uttama. In the first canto of the Bhagavatam, 6th chapter, it's mentioned that when the mother of Narad Muni dies, Srila Prabhupada notes that arrangement by the Lord to remove the obstacles for his bhakti. Similarly, when Prithu Maharaj, we'll read that later, when he retires into the forest with his wife Archi, then Prithu Maharaj gives up his body, and then Queen Archi, all alone in the forest, she lights the funeral fire and enters into it. So externally it may be appearing that Archi is being punished. However, later on we see that both of them head to Vaikuntha glorified by the sages. Similarly, the Maushal Leela in the Mahabharata appears to be a consequence of the curse of Gandhari. Gandhari had cursed Krishna that just like you have destroyed my descendants, may all your descendants die. And one may think that the Maushal Leela is a consequence of the curse of Gandhari. But then if you look at the pastime in a broader context, as we did when we were doing the third canto, it was actually a ploy by the Lord to wrap up his pastimes. His personal associates went back to Vaikuntha, the Devas went back to the heavenly kingdom, and the earth was relieved of the burden. So the point is that the pastime needs to be seen in its entirety. So while the Bhagavatam does not talk about the future of Suruchi and Uttama, one can just assume that because of the favorable connection with Dhruva, because of the repentance of Suruchi, because of the affection of Dhruva for Uttama, because of the respect of Dhruva for Suruchi, the destination was certainly exalted. So, in many cases, we have access, like in the case of Prithu Maharaj and Archie, we have access to what happened after that. That they went back to Vaikuntha. The Acharyas reveal what happened after the Maushal Leela. In this case, we do not have access, but it's on the same lines. That the incident of the death of Suruchi and Uttam should not be looked in isolation, but it should be looked as a parallel incident to the other incidents, where a seemingly unfavorable event is actually a chain that leads to a much more favorable destination. Okay, verse 5. Gatvodichem disham raja rudranuchar sevitam dadarshahim avadronyam Purim Ghuya Kashankulam. Dhruva Maharaj went to the northern direction of the Himalayan range. In a valley, he saw a city full of ghostly persons who were followers of Lord Shiva. So Prabhupada says that in this verse it is stated that the Yakshas are more or less devotees of Lord Shiva. By this indication, the Yakshas may be taken to be the Himalayan tribes like the Tibetans. Verse 6. Dadamau shankam brahad bhau kham dishas chanudadayam yeno dvigna drishakshata upadevyo trishan vrisham. Maitreya continued, my dear Vidur, as soon as Dhruva Maharaj reached Alkapuri, he immediately blew his conch shell, and the sound reverberated throughout the entire sky and in every direction. The wives of the Yakshas became very much frightened. From their eyes it was appeared that they were full of anxiety. So the blowing of the conch is an indication of the beginning of battle. Tato niskramya balina Upadeva Mahabhata Ashantastaninadam Abhipetor Udayudaha. O hero Vidur, the greatly powerful heroes of the Yakshas, unable to tolerate the resounding vibration of the conch shell of Dhruva Maharaj, came forth from their city with weapons and attacked Dhruva. So attacking somebody in their house is always considered to be one of the most serious offenses. If you meet in a battlefield or if the battle is prearranged, then everybody is calm at the time. But Dhruva Maharaj went all the way to Alkapuri and blew his conch there. So the previous verse talks about the wives of the Yakshas. So so this is the nature of men, that when they see that their women are getting disconcerted and fearful, then whatever anger they are feeling gets multiplied several times over. So Dhruva is there right outside the city and instilling fear in their wives. And the Yakshas by nature are warriors. At another place, it said that the Yakshas are like forest spirits. But here it is clearly said that they're warriors with mystical powers. And so with their weapons, they come and they attack Dhruva. Verse 8. Satana patato vira Ugradhanva Maharataha Ekam yoga pat sarvam ahon bane stribi. Though Maharaj, who was a great charioteer and certainly a great woman also, immediately began to kill them by simultaneously discharging arrows, three at a time. So in 5 verses is the preliminary description of the battle. The Dhruva is releasing 3 arrows at a time and is beginning to kill the Yakshas. Clearly, they're not much of a match for him. Verse 9. Devai lalat lagnestera ishubhi sarva evahi matva nirastamatmanam asmashan karma tasyata. When the heroes of the Yaksha saw that all their heads were being thus threatened by Dhruva, Maharaj, they could very easily understand their awkward position, and they concluded that they would certainly be defeated. But as heroes, they lauded the action of Dhruva. So Vishwanath Chakravarti says that they praised him in their minds. They did not speak it out loudly. Prabhupada says that the spirit of fighting in a sporting attitude is very significant in this verse. So Prabhupada uses sporting not to indicate that it's a fun thing, but more to say that in a chivalrous attitude. So chivalry is when you fight because the circumstances want you to do it, but you do it without personal malice or hatred for the other person. So the Yakshas, when they're seeing Dhruva's expertise in fighting, then they're appreciating it. So that's why, as heroes, they lauded the action of Dhruva, because they themselves were very valiant. They themselves were very courageous. And so when they could see another warrior who was more so than them, they appreciated it. Verse 10. Te pichamum apratisana. I'm sorry. Te apuchamum amratsanta padasparsham ivoragaha sharira vidyan yugapad dvigunam parichikshavaha. Just like serpents who cannot tolerate being trampled upon by anyone's feet, the Yakshas, being intolerant of the wonderful prowess of Dhruva Maharaj, threw twice as many arrows, 6 from each of their shoulders, and thus they very valiantly exhibited their prowess. So even though they were appreciating the valor of Dhruva, the skills of Dhruva, but that does not mean that they accepted defeat. So they were responding in kind. Maitreya says that just like serpents cannot tolerate being trampled upon. So the Yakshas as warriors, they could not tolerate the battle given to them by Dhruva. Now, one of the points here, of course, is that Dhruva Maharaj is fighting alone, and the Yakshas are fighting as an army. That does not seem to bother them. And one of the reasons is, this is explained in the Mahabharata, that there are different classifications of warriors. So there is the Ardha Yodha, there is the Yodha, there is the Rathi, then there is the Maharathi, and there is the Atirathi. And the classification is based upon how many enemies can face. Ardha Yodha can face half a warrior. Yodha can face one warrior. Rathi is one who can face a chariot. Maharathi is one who can fight with 10,000 chariots at the same time. And Atirathi is one who can fight with unlimited warriors at the same time. So the Yakshas, realizing that Maharaj Dhruva has the position of being an Atirathi, they consider it to be fair that while he is alone, they are fighting as an army. Verse 11-12. Tata pariga nistrimsha prashushul paraswadehe shaktyarishtibir bhushundibis chitravaja sharerapi abhyavarsam prakopitaha Saratam sahasaratham ichantistar pratikartum ayutanam trayodasa. The Yaksha soldiers were 130,000 strong, all greatly angry and all desiring to defeat the wonderful activities of Dhruva Maharaj. With full strength, they showered upon Maharaj Dhruva, along with his chariot and charioteer, various types of feathered arrows, parikas, iron bludgeons, nistrimasas, swords, prashulas, tridents, prashvadas, lances, shaktis, pikes, rishtis, spears, and bhushundi weapons. So previously it was mentioned that each of the yaksha was throwing 6 arrows at a time. So given that there were 130,000 of the yakshas, one can imagine that more than 750,000 arrows were simultaneously being thrown on Dhruva, in addition to all these other kinds of weapons. But because Dhruva is described or considered as an Atirati, he is qualified to fight unlimited opponents at the same time. So he's able to neutralize all these weapons that are coming at him and simultaneously attack the yakshas with his own weapons. Verse 13. Autan padisa tada shastravarsena bhurina na eva drashyata channa asarena yatagari. Dhruva Maharaj was completely covered by an incessant shower of weapons, just as a mountain is covered by incessant rainfall. So next 5 verses, Maitreya describes the battle with the help of different kind of analogies. So Prabhupada says that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur points out in this connection that although Dhruva Maharaj was covered by the incessant arrows of the enemy, that does not mean that he succumbed in the battle. The example of a mountain peak covered by incessant rain is just suitable. For when a mountain is covered by incessant rain, all dirty things are washed from the body of the mountain. Similarly, the incessant shower of arrows from the enemy gave Dhruva Maharaj new vigor to defeat them. In other words, whatever incompetency he might have had was washed away. Or whatever compassion that he might have had, or whatever consideration he might have had, all that is washed away by this analogy that is given, that a mountain is covered by incessant rain, but the rain cannot do anything to the mountain other than clean it. Similarly, the weapons that were being thrown at Dhruva Maharaj, they were not harming it. All it was doing was increasing his resolve and determination and washing away any hesitations that he might have. Okay, verse 14. Ahakaras siddhanam vivipashyatam hatoyam manavo shuryo magna punya janarnave. All the siddhas from the higher planetary system were observing the fight from the sky. And when they saw that Dhruva Maharaj had been covered by the incessant arrows of the enemy, they rode tumultuously. The grandson of Manu, Dhruva, is now lost. They cried that Dhruva Maharaj was just like the sun, that now he had been set within the ocean of the yakshas. Second analogy. Previous was the mountain being washed by the rains. Now that the son of Dhruva Maharaj has been engulfed by the ocean of the Yakshas. So Rupa Goswami, Prabhupada quotes Rupa Goswami here saying that to explain that why were the Siddhas crying tumultuously? They didn't really have an iron in the fire over here. Supposedly they were neutral. But still we see them rooting for Dhruva Maharaj. When they see that Dhruva Maharaj has apparently been conquered by the Yakshas, they're perturbed by it. And the reason is that Prabhupada quotes Rupa Goswami that not only a devotee is well protected by the Supreme Lord, all the demigods and even ordinary men are anxious for his security and safety. And a classic example of that is Srila Prabhupada himself. That at an advanced stage, with very little support, he headed out, not just out of his house or out of his city, but out of his country. And almost everywhere that he went, he found somebody to protect him. Because everybody has a intrinsic desire to serve Krishna, and those who carry Krishna in their heart. So the comparison is that Dhruva appeared to merge in the ocean of the Yakshas. So Prabhupada said that when the sun sets on the horizon, it appears that the sun drowns in the ocean. But factually, the sun has no difficulty. Similarly, although Dhruva appeared to drown in the ocean of the Yakshas, he had no difficulty. As the sun rises again in the course at the end of the night, so Dhruva Maharaj, although he may have been in difficulty, because after all it was a fight, and in any fighting activities, there are reverse, does not mean that he was defeated. And so Prabhupada is explaining the full purport of the analogy. That while the sun may seem to be drowned in the ocean, but a person who has a broader perspective knows that the sun will rise again. And the same thing will happen to Dhruva Maharaj. Verse 15. Nadashtu ya tudhaneshu jaya kasheshvatho mrde utadishadratastasya niharadiva bhaskaraha. The Yakshas, being temporarily victorious, exclaimed that they had conquered Dhruva Maharaj. But in the meantime, Dhruva's chariot suddenly appeared, just as the sun suddenly appears from within the foggy mist. Third analogy. The appearance of Dhruva's chariot is the appearance compared to the appearance of the sun in the mist. And Prabhupada says that this fog or mist, it is insignificant in comparison with the sun. So although sometimes because of the arrangement of nature, the sun may be appeared to be covered by mist, but then the sun, it can in no time burn away the mist and blow it away. So similarly, temporarily it's looking that Dhruva is covered by the victory of the Yakshas, but just like the sun blows away the fog, one can expect Dhruva to do that very soon. Verse 16. Dhanur vishpo rajayan divyam div shatam khedam udvahan astragam vyadhanamad bane gananimika ivanilaha. Dhruva Maharaj's bow and arrow twanged and hissed, causing lamentation in the hearts of his enemies. He began to shoot incessant arrows, shattering all the different weapons, just as the blasting wind scatters the assembled clouds in the sky. Fourth analogy, that when the wind comes, when it is in full force, then the clouds that are in the sky covering the sun, in no time they are dispersed. So Dhruva Maharaj was temporarily covered by the arrows and the weapons of the Yaksha, but then his bow and arrow twanged and hissed, causing lamentation in the hearts of his devotees. Okay. Verse 17. Tasyate chap nirmukta vitvavarma nirakshasham kayana vishushtigma girina shanayo yatha. The sharp arrows released from the bow of Dhruva Maharaj pierced the shields and bodies of the enemy, like the thunderbolt released by the King of Heaven, which dismantles the bodies of the mountain. Fourth analogy given, the thunderbolt released by the King of Heaven dismantled the bodies of the mountains. So this analogy comes from a pastime that was, or an event that happens early in the creation, that it is said that at the time the mountains had wings and they could fly. And the only problem was that because they were large and heavy, when they would fly and then they would land, so they would destroy people and trees and forests. So people were complaining that this is a big danger. Anytime huge mountains come and land on us. So then Indra, with his thunderbolt, he cut off the wings of the mountain, and after that they became stationary. So we see 5 analogies to describe the battle between Dhruva and Yaksha. Dhruva became covered by the shower of weapons, just as the mountain is covered by the torrent of rain. Right? And the significance is that the mountain may seem to be covered by rain, but actually it is getting washed and purified by it. Then the second analogy is that when the Siddhas saw Dhruva being covered by the arrows, then they compared it with the sun setting in the ocean of the Yakshas. And the understanding is that, so I have this as a table that I can send to you. You don't have to note it down. The understanding is that although the sun appears to drown in the ocean, but it's never harmed and it reappears. So although Dhruva seemed to be in difficulty, but he will regain his position. Then in verse 15, we have, as the Yakshas proclaim victory, Dhruva re-emerged. The analogy that is given, that as the sun reappears from the foggy mist. And the significance is that the mist may cover the sun temporarily, but the sun is much more powerful than the mist, and it can burn it away anytime it wants. So the greatness of Dhruva is being reaffirmed here. Then in verse 16, we see that Dhruva scattering the weapons of Yaksha with his arrows is compared to the wind scattering the clouds in the sky. And the twanging of his bows creating dismay in the heart of the Yakshas. Then 17th verse, which is the current verse, that the sharp arrows of Dhruva pierce the bodies of the Yakshas, just as the thunderbolt of Indra pierces the body of the mountains. So earlier the mountain of Dhruva was revitalized by the attacks of the Yaksha. Now the mountain of Yaksha is being annihilated by the arrows of Dhruva. Okay, so I'll do a few more verses and then we'll pause for any discussion. Verse 18, 19. Bhale sanchedayamananam shirobhischaru kundalahe rubirhe matalabhe dorbirvalyavalgubihi harkeyor mukuttera Ushnashescha mahadhanahi astrastarano bhuvo rejurvira manoharaha. The great sage Maitreya continued, My dear Vidur, the heads of those who were cut to pieces by the arrows of Dhruva Maharaj were decorated very beautifully with earrings and turbans. The legs of their bodies were as beautiful as the golden palm trees. Their arms were decorated with golden bracelets and armlets, and on their heads there were very valuable helmets bedecked with gold. All these ornaments lying on the battlefield were very attractive and could bewilder the mind of a hero. So, attractive for a Kshatriya. So remember, when a Kshatriya is in a battle, his mood is ghora, ghastly, one of the secondary results. Just like Bhishma was appreciating the blood on the body of Krishna that he had inflicted, and the mood of a warrior. So Maitreya is describing this from the perspective of a warrior, that the battlefield is resplendent with pierced arms and legs and torsos and heads, and covered with all kinds of jewels on them. And Prabhupada also notes that that the soldiers in those days were highly decorated with golden ornaments and helmets and turbans. And when they were dead, their booty was taken by the enemy party. Their falling dead in the battle with many golden ornaments, dresses was certainly a lucrative opportunity for the heroes on the battlefield. So Prabhupada is saying that why would this bewilder? They would get bewildered by all the wealth that was lying over there for them to take as the spoil of the war. Verse 20. Hatavastishtitarerana rakshuganakshatrivaray sayakahe prayo vibhakna vayana vidudruivo mrgenda vikrida yutapa eva. The remaining yakshas, who somehow or the other were not killed, had the limbs cut to pieces by the arrows of the great warrior Dhruva Maharaj. Thus they began to flee, just as elephants flee when defeated by a lion. So the analogy is to indicate the sizes. The elephant is much, much larger than a lion. And even in a herd, they are impressive. But when the lion comes and the elephants, they run away. Similarly, the yakshas had a huge army, and Dhruva was all alone. But by his heroic powers, now he is causing them to either fall dead in the battlefield or run away in fear of him. Verse 21. Pashyamana satadathyanim mahamride kanchan manovatuma purim didriksham apina visam namayanam veda chikrishatam janaha. Dhruva Maharaj, the best of human beings, observed that in the great battlefield, not one of the opposing soldiers was left standing with proper weapons. He then desired to see the city of Alkapuri, but he thought to himself, no one knows the plans of the mystic yakshas. So, seeing that either the yakshas were dead or wounded, Dhruva first thinks that the battle is over. So he wants to take advantage of the presence there to see the beautiful city of Alkapuri. But then he becomes cautious. He says, no one knows what the plans of the mystic yakshas are. So, and this is also the nature of Mayavi, that the attacks are from the most unexpected fronts. For instance, Dhruva Maharaj, he had the quality of compassion. And Mayadevi used that quality to make him fall. In the 5th canto, we see that the father of Bharat Maharaj, Rishabdev, he refuses to accept mystic powers because he says that I cannot trust my mind. Similarly, we see in the case of Ajmer that he was a practicing devotee, but simply by seeing a prostitute with another man, he fell. So one may think that one is protected from all fronts, but unknown to you, there is a chink in the armor, and Maya Devi takes advantage of that, which is why very important to be vigilant and in the association of devotees. Okay, so I'll stop over here, and we'll continue on Wednesday. We should finish this chapter and also be able to start the next chapter. So I'll stop here and see if there's any questions or comments.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Not a question. Even though it was a very fierce battle, with all these analogies, it looked like very poetic.
It does. I think that's the beauty of great personalities like Maitreya and Sukadev Goswami. That everything that they are saying, they're giving a lesson there. And Srila Prabhupada, at another point, he says that when great men speak, they speak in poetry. When common men speak, they speak in prose. But when great men speak, they speak in poetry. When Krishna instructed Arjun, then he sang the Bhagavad and Gita. So in the Brahma Samhita, what's that word? Shriya Kanta Kanta Parma Parshikal Tarovar Dhuma Bhumis Chintamani Gadamai Toyam Amritam Katha Ganam Natyam Katha Ganam. That in the spiritual world, every word is a song, every step is a dance. So this being poetic and speaking in analogies and speaking with metaphors, this is quality of refined intellect. So thank you for pointing out. Okay, so we'll stop here and resume on Wednesday. Vanchakalpatarubhayascha kripa sindhubhya vacho patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Anant Koti Vaishnavim ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Jai Gaur Premanande. Hare Krishna, thank you very much.